June 4, 2013. Huntsville, Alabama. The kind of day that feels hand-polished by sunlight. Blue air. Sweet, dry heat rising from the blacktop. The Tennessee River dragging its reflection like a ribbon of glass. Everything calm until the machines began to panic. By noon, inside the National Weather Service, the radar screens were bleeding color. A storm was blooming fast, thick and wrong. Technicians leaned in, whispering numbers that didn't make sense. No rain gauges spiked, no lightning strikes logged. But the screen kept swelling, a pulsing bruise of red and orange devouring the map. They called it the blob. Probably a front that slipped the model, one said. Maybe ground clutter, another muttered. But outside, people still ate sandwiches under the sky that refused to cloud. At 4:02 p.m., the anomaly stretched over the entire city. Houses, highways, churches, schools, all swallowed by a storm that didn't exist. The weathermen stared into the static, and for a brief second, they were children again, staring at ghosts. When the truth arrived, it came from the Army, one dry sentence, bureaucratic and bloodless. A routine chaff test was conducted from Redstone Arsenal. That was all. Chaff. Millions of thin metallic strips, each lighter than a breath, scattered through the air to blind radar. A technology older than any man in the control room. Born in another war, forged by another kind of storm. No one there knew her name. But that phantom on their radar, those bright false clouds dancing over Alabama, were the fingerprints of a woman who had died 14 years earlier. Her name was Joan Curran, and she once helped change the face of war without ever firing a gun. The story of radar chaff begins not in the humid American South, but in the dark belly of another century when Europe was splitting open. In 1939, thunder did not fall from the sky, it rolled across borders. Hitler's army swallowed Poland. France braced. Britain held its breath. Science was drafted. Every physicist, mathematician, and radio engineer who could solder a wire or read an oscilloscope was pulled from universities and locked into laboratories humming with secrecy. And in Cambridge, behind brick walls damp with fog, a young woman in a lab coat was about to disappear into history. Her name then was Joan Struthers, a girl from Swansea, a Welsh coast child who had grown up chasing tides and breaking shells to see how they worked. She had entered Newnham College on scholarship, studied physics when few women dared to, and rowed in the mornings before lectures. Her hands knew both the weight of an oar and the fragility of glass tubing. When war came, Cambridge emptied of laughter. The great Cavendish laboratory, birthplace of the atom, began turning its gaze toward death. Joan was assigned to a quiet, brilliant Scot named Samuel Curran. Together, they calibrated instruments, measured voltages, mapped invisible waves. He was reserved. She was all intensity, fire beneath discipline, the kind of partnership that either breaks or becomes legend. By 1940, the world broke. Bombs fell over London. The Royal Air Force bled in the skies. The couple was transferred south, to Exeter, then to a secret branch of Britain's telecommunications research establishment, TRE, a name as dull as the miracles it contained. Their orders were simple: find a way to make our bombers invisible. Invisible. In a war of machines, the word was almost blasphemy. Radar was the new god of detection, an eye that saw through darkness. The Germans used it to guide night fighters. The British used it to save their shores. Whoever could fool it, even for minutes, could change the outcome of entire battles. Joan began experimenting. She cut strips of metal foil, wires, sheets, crumpled aluminum. Nothing seemed right. The radar echoes flickered like dying stars. Too large, too small, too heavy, too fragile. The lab filled with the smell of metal dust and burnt circuitry. She kept working, fueled by tea and the constant drumming of bombs somewhere far away. Her notebook from that period, pages now yellow and guarded in archives, reads like a battlefield log. Tried copper filament, response poor. Aluminum leaf unstable under airflow. Need resonance at lambda divided by 2. Experiment again. For nearly a year, she lived in a haze of equations and exhaustion. Around her, men came and went, often taking credit before the ink dried. But Joan was not chasing glory. She was chasing precision, the perfect frequency match that could turn emptiness into illusion. Then, one night in 1942, she found it. A strip 25 centimeters long, 1.5 wide, cut from aluminized paper, half the wavelength of the German radar band. When dropped, it shimmered and twisted in the air, catching and re-radiating every pulse of radio energy like 1,000 false hearts beating at once. She watched the oscilloscope flare. The signal bloomed, dense, unreadable. The radar was blind. She'd done it. From that moment, the war itself began to tilt. The tests moved from lab to sky. Bundles of chaff, she called them window, were loaded into Lancaster bombers. Crews were instructed, open the hatch, toss a bundle every minute. Within seconds, the radar screens of the German Luftwaffe filled with chaos phantoms, entire fleets that did not exist. Pilots cursed, gunners fired into empty air. Joan's smokescreen of metal and math saved thousands. In July 1943, during Operation Gomorrah, Allied bombers turned Hamburg into a furnace. It was the largest firestorm in modern history. 40,000 dead. The cost of victory is always written in the language of ash. But that night, out of 791 aircraft, only 12 were lost. 12. Because of her work. Those numbers would never bear her name. The reports filed the invention under countermeasure. Type X. Type X. As if history itself was embarrassed to admit the gender of its savior. Yet even in triumph, the paradox held. What she invented to hide others also erased her. After Hamburg, chaff became the Allied secret weapon. By 1944, as the tide of war turned, Joan and her husband moved among classified projects, whispering with physicists whose discoveries glowed brighter than morality. Manhattan was calling. So was Los Alamos. But before she left England, her creation would play one more role, its greatest deception. Flash forward again, June 5th, 1944, the eve of D-Day. The English Channel breathing fog. Hundreds of ships ready to lunge toward Normandy. And in the night sky, 2 tiny squadrons of bombers flying north, away from the true invasion path. Their orders were simple. Release window continuously. Each packet burst open like a silver flower. Millions of strips tumbling down, drifting, reflecting, becoming a ghost army. On German radar, an entire phantom fleet was approaching the wrong coast. Commanders diverted men and guns toward empty water. While they stared at echoes, the real Allied forces stormed the beaches. It was a magician's trick on a continental scale, conceived by a woman who would never be photographed at a general's table. The wave of invasion that began the end of the war rode behind her mirage. And so, decades later, when a radar in Alabama trembled under a false storm, it was as if the past had flickered back to life. The same ghost, the same shimmer, a spectral salute from history's blind spot. No one in the weather office spoke her name. But the invisible woman was there, woven into the static, humming through every echo. Joan Curran, the physicist who turned aluminum into armor, intellect into invisibility. Her invention had outlived empires, and still the sky remembered. The radar image faded that evening. The technicians clocked out. The city went home to dinner under a clean sky. But somewhere, across the Atlantic, in archives and footnotes, her legacy was whispering thin as paper, sharp as light. Because that's what chaff is, and that's what Joan was. Not destruction, but disappearance used for mercy. A defense disguised as confusion. A woman written out of the record, yet inscribed forever in the frequency of the air. And if the wind catches the right angle, if the radar hums just right, you can still see her work. A phantom storm, drifting above a quiet world, reminding us that sometimes the greatest victories are invisible, Before radar sang its invisible hymns, before the sky became a chessboard of machines, there was a girl on the Welsh coast, bare feet on cold sand, eyes fixed on the horizon. Joan Struthers, born in 1916, grew up in Swansea, where the wind carried salt and coal dust in the same breath. Wales was an industrial hymn sung in minor key steel, smoke, grey mornings, hard edges. Children learned to endure, not to dream. Joan was different. She wanted to know how the world worked, not just how to survive it. Her father kept a small shop. Her mother kept faith in education. When the tides rose, she watched ships drag themselves across the bay, black hulls scraping against light. She wondered how they stayed afloat, how sound traveled across fog, why lightning could find a ship but not a bird. She asked questions until grown men shrugged. At 17, she won a full scholarship to Cambridge, to Newnham College, one of the few sanctuaries for women with minds sharper than the era could accept. In 1934, Cambridge was still a fortress of male privilege, 5,000 students, fewer than 100 women in physics. The corridors smelled of chalk and tobacco, the portraits were all of men. Women could study, yes, but not graduate. They could master the equations of the universe, but not earn the parchment that proved it. Joan didn't come to be recognized. She came to learn. She rowed at dawn, her oars hauling through mist like blades through silk. She studied through the night, fingers ink-stained, eyes raw from reading Fermi, Maxwell, Dirac. Her body was small, her energy volcanic. She learned to solder circuits, to hear the hum of electrons, to measure light itself. The Cavendish laboratory became her second skin, a temple of cables and vacuum tubes, where the new priesthood of physics was rewriting the laws of the world. They called her the quiet one who worked like two men. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. By 1938, Europe was vibrating with dread. Spain burned in civil war. Germany's shadow lengthened over Czechoslovakia. The newspapers still spoke of diplomacy. The scientists stopped believing. In Cambridge, Joan finished her coursework, earned the right to a degree, but the law said she couldn't have it. Women could not receive degrees from the university. Her diploma would wait another half-century. Still, she stayed. The Cavendish needed assistance. And it was there, in that cathedral of experiment, that she met Samuel Curran, a quiet Scotsman whose precision matched her fire. He was tall, deliberate, with a mind tuned like a radio to frequencies no one else heard. Together they built measuring devices for particle studies, coils, counters, oscillators. They worked late into nights that smelled of ozone and tin. Their partnership was forged, not in romance, but in rigor. Two minds sharpening each other in the echo of machinery. Later, love would arrive quietly, like voltage rising across a wire. Outside the lab, history was turning black and white. Hitler invaded Poland in September 1939. Britain declared war. Overnight, the physicists of Britain became soldiers without uniforms. Cambridge emptied into the war effort. The call went out. Scientists are needed for national defense. Joan and Sam answered. They were sent first to Glasgow, then Exeter, to a converted warehouse disguised as a dairy plant. The place had no windows, only the smell of oil and urgency. The government called it a research unit. Inside, it was a forge of fear and invention. They joined a team developing proximity fuses, small, savage devices that would allow shells to explode when near an enemy plane, not upon contact. It was the science of distance and death. They spent months crawling through equations, soldering detonators the size of thumbnails, dragging cables through mud fields for test launches. Every miscalculation was an explosion waiting to happen. They failed, recalibrated, tried again. Each success meant 1,000 lives saved in the next raid. Each failure left scorch marks on their hands. In November 1940, with London still burning from the Blitz, Joan and Sam married in Exeter. The wedding was quick, a single photograph, grainy and grey. Two young faces, eyes heavy from sleepless nights. The war didn't pause for vows. They returned to the lab the next morning. Love, in wartime, was measured in borrowed hours. That winter, Britain lived in blackout. Windows painted over, street lamps dimmed. The hum of bombers overhead became the country's heartbeat. In this darkness, a new kind of warfare was being born: radar. The principle was simple: send out a pulse, wait for the echo. The timing revealed distance, shape, speed. The Germans had it, so did the British. Whoever learned to trick it would control the night. In 1941, the Korans were transferred again, this time to the Telecommunications Research Establishment, TRE, under the legendary R.V. Jones. The base lay deep in the English countryside, surrounded by hedges and barbed wire. The official story was meteorological research. Inside, it was the nerve center of electronic warfare. The work was relentless. The air smelled of solder and coffee. Every experiment felt like pulling a thread that might unravel the war. Men argued over frequencies, women scribbled formulas, oscilloscopes glowed green like haunted mirrors. It was here that Joan began a new obsession: how to make radar see what wasn't there. The idea came from her work with radio waves. Thin metallic strips, she knew, could resonate when cut to half the wavelength of a radar signal. What if, she thought, you filled the sky with thousands of such strips? Wouldn't the radar drown in its own reflections? She started experimenting, first with copper, then aluminum, then tinfoil scavenged from cigarette packets. She built small bundles, dropped them from ladders, watched the instruments twitch. Most days ended in failure. The echoes were too weak, the materials too heavy. But Joan was relentless. Her notes from that period were written like a diary of endurance. Signal lost, retest tomorrow. To then say air resistance excessive. Need to find lambda divided by 2 resonance precisely. She cut, measured, tested again. Weeks bled into months. Bombers roared overhead as she worked, shaking dust from the rafters. At night, she walked the base perimeter, breathing in the smell of wet metal and smoke, wondering if she was chasing madness or miracle. Science, she once told a colleague, is faith without witness. You believe first, proof comes later. By the spring of 1942, her perseverance began to crystallize. One night, the radar screen bloomed, not with noise, but with perfect chaos. The strips she dropped, 25 centimeters long and 1.5 wide, had matched the enemy radar's wavelength exactly. The echoes multiplied, filled the entire display. The radar was blind. Her colleagues stared, stunned. Joan just smiled, her hands trembling from exhaustion. She'd created a storm of ghosts. The project was classified immediately. The code name, Window. The next phase would move from theory to sky. Outside, the war devoured cities. Inside, she kept building illusions. The same intellect that once studied sunlight on water now shaped the false shimmer of radar echoes. History would remember the battles. Few would remember the woman who bent physics to save men she'd never meet. And as 1942 gave way to 1943, as the Allies prepared their next great push, Joan Curran stood in a hangar watching bundles of her invention loaded into bombers. Each packet weighed 1 pound. Each was a weapon made of nothing but paper and faith. She didn't know it yet, but those fragile strips would soon blot out German radar across the continent and change the sky forever. The English countryside in 1942 was a study in contrasts: green hills under grey skies, birdsong cut short by the growl of bombers overhead. Somewhere between the hedgerows and the secret fences of the Telecommunications Research Establishment, a woman carried the weight of a new kind of weapon. She didn't wear a uniform. She wore a lab coat, stained with graphite and oil. Her name was Joan Curran, and she was building a weapon made of air. Inside the TRE compound, everything hummed. Generators groaned, typewriters clattered, radar dishes turned like patient predators scanning for ghosts. The war was no longer fought with bayonets, it was fought with equations. In one corner of a dim laboratory, Joan dragged wires across the floor, feeding voltage into a radar transmitter. She had been at it for months. Her workspace looked more like a scrapyard than a lab. Scraps of aluminum foil, crumpled cigarette wrappers, half-melted coils. Every experiment was a battlefield. Her goal was simple and impossible at once: confuse the enemy's radar. The Germans had built the best early warning network in Europe. Their Würzburg and Freya radar systems could spot bombers 60 miles out, track their altitude, and guide night fighters to intercept. For Britain's air crews, that meant flying into a gun barrel every night. Joan wanted to blind that barrel. She'd learned that a radar wave could be fooled if it struck something cut to the right length, half its wavelength. That was the trick. But finding the perfect shape, the perfect metal, the perfect density, that was her war. So she kept cutting. Thin strips, wide sheets, rolled wires. Each one dropped through the air, tested, measured, logged. Most failed. The oscilloscope screamed static, then silence. Sam Curran tried to make her stop for the night. She refused. "If radar can see everything," she said, "then we'll teach it how to dream." Winter bled into spring. Bombers still burned over Europe. The RAF lost hundreds every month. At TRE, the scientists worked under blackout curtains, sleeping on benches, surviving on ration tea. Joan's hair went grey at the edges. Her notebooks filled faster than her rations. And then, one midnight test in April 1942, something changed. She cut a strip of aluminized paper, 25 centimeters long, 1.5 centimeters wide, half the wavelength of the German radar band. She tied 10 together with a thin string. She climbed onto a small metal staircase, tossed them into the air. On the screen across the lab, the radar pulse exploded into chaos. No signal, no clarity, just a vast bloom of echoes like a storm forming from nothing. The technicians stared. Joan didn't smile. She was watching history dissolve into static. Window, she called it. A window made not of glass, but of deception. The code name stuck. Operation Window, a curtain of falsehood to cover real machines. The British High Command didn't know what to do with it. It was brilliant, yes, but dangerous. If the Allies used it, the Germans could copy it within weeks. Both sides would be blind. Meetings stretched for months. Generals argued. Some called it suicidal, others called it genius. Joan waited. She kept refining. She calculated the dispersion rate, the ideal drop height, the timing for each release. Every 1-pound bundle could fill a square mile of radar sky. A single bomber could hide an entire fleet. In her lab journal, she wrote, "A few thousand strips can blind a nation." By early 1943, the decision came down. The risk was worth it. The first field test would be part of a larger operation, one the RAF called Gomorrah. Hamburg, the 24th of July, 1943. The night air over Germany trembled. Hundreds of RAF bombers climbed from the English coast, engines dragging the weight of history. Inside each aircraft sat bundles of chaff, Joan's invention, cut to her specifications, tied by hand in her lab. At 1 a.m., over the North Sea, the first crew opened their hatch. The bundles fell. The air filled with silver rain. Each strip caught the radar pulse and threw it back, 1,000 false aircraft blooming on every German screen. On the ground, Luftwaffe operators panicked. Their scopes turned white. Hundreds of targets appeared, multiplying, splitting, merging. They couldn't tell sky from static. One officer shouted, "They are everywhere." In truth, there were fewer than 800 bombers. The German defenses fired blind. Searchlights swept nothing. Night fighters circled in confusion. Above, the real bombers glided unseen through the chaos. That night, the RAF lost only 12 aircraft out of 791, the lowest loss rate in years. The effect was beyond anything command had dared hope. When the bombers returned at dawn, their wings streaked with ash, the engineers at TRE stayed silent. The victory was real, but the destruction was staggering. Hamburg burned for a week. 40,000 dead. The sky itself was black. Joan read the reports in her small room at Malvern. She didn't weep. She didn't celebrate. She simply closed the file and whispered, "It worked." For a few weeks, Window was the most powerful secret in Europe. The British guarded it as fiercely as the atom. Only a handful of scientists even knew her name. The rest of the world thought radar blindness was luck, divine or otherwise. Then came the next challenge, how to use the illusion not just to shield, but to mislead. Joan's clouds of chaff had done more than hide bombers. They had created phantoms, entire ghost fleets that radar operators believed were real. That idea would grow into something far larger, far stranger. In early 1944, the Allies began planning Operation Overlord, the invasion of occupied France. The scale was unimaginable. 150,000 troops, 5,000 ships, the largest amphibious assault in history. But for it to work, the Germans had to be looking in the wrong direction, and so the planners turned again to the woman who could make armies out of thin air. Joan was transferred back to the coast for new trials. She met with intelligence officers, cartographers, mathematicians. Together they mapped the Normandy deception plan, a network of false radio chatter, inflatable tanks, and radar ghosts. 2 small missions would use her chaff to create entire phantom fleets off the French coast. They were called Operation Glimmer and Operation Taxable. It was her illusion, scaled to myth. Each aircraft would drop bundles of window in a precise pattern, simulating an armada approaching the wrong beaches. German radar would see invasion where there was none. And while they scrambled north, the real Allied force would strike south at Normandy. Joan tested the timing herself. In a drafty hangar lit by a single bulb, she counted seconds between drops, scribbling the data into her notebook. Every strip must fall like breath, she told the pilots. Too soon, and the illusion breaks. By spring 1944, she had built a new version of window, lighter, faster, more reflective. She packaged it in plain brown bundles, stamped only with serial numbers. She'd never stand on a battlefield, never hear the sea guns roar. But when D-Day came, her creation would be there first, floating above the waves, masking the truth with brilliance. That spring, someone asked if she ever feared what she'd made. She thought for a long moment. Then she said, "I don't fear the weapon. I fear the forgetting." She knew her work would vanish behind classified walls, buried under the names of men who signed the orders. But the sky would remember. Every time radar blurs, every time a false echo blooms, a fragment of her genius moves through the air, silent, invisible, unstoppable. The war was changing shape. No longer just bullets and bombs, but signals and shadows, illusions and counter-illusions. Joan Curran had shown the Allies how to weaponize confusion and how to win with it. From the fields of Malvern to the clouds over Hamburg, she'd proven that knowledge could be sharper than steel. And as 1943 gave way to 1944, the stage was set for her greatest deception, yet one that would hide the largest invasion in human history behind a curtain of ghosts. The woman who built a smokescreen for the sky was about to make the world's most dangerous storm disappear. By the spring of 1944, England had become one long military lung, breathing, holding, waiting. Every road jammed with trucks, every farmhouse wired with radios, every sky trembling under the weight of anticipation. The invasion of Europe was no longer a question, it was a countdown. From above, the southern coast looked like a bruise spreading along the white cliffs. Tanks hid under netting, soldiers drilled in the rain. At every airfield, the hum of engines whispered the same word, Overlord. And among those invisible preparations, at a secluded hangar in Kent, Joan Curran returned to the weapon that could make a continent blink. She had been here before, the same smell of oil and cordite, the same echo of boots on concrete. But this time the stakes were heavier. She wasn't just protecting bombers, she was protecting an entire army. The Allies needed to convince the Germans that the invasion would strike far from Normandy near Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel. The whole plan depended on illusion. Joan knew illusion better than anyone alive. Her invention, Window, had already cloaked hundreds of bombers in spectral disguise. Now it would become something larger, a ghost armada. The operations were codenamed Taxable and Glimmer, words that sounded harmless, almost pretty, but held within them the power to alter the shape of war. If they worked, German radar operators would see fleets that didn't exist, ships made of echoes, shadows made of math. In late May, she met with the deception planners inside a smoke-stained room at the Air Ministry. On the wall hung a vast map of the French coast, pinned with colored strings. An intelligence officer traced a line north of Normandy. "We'll make them look here," he said, tapping Calais. "You'll give us the ghosts." Joan nodded. "We'll need 20 aircraft, maybe more, each one dropping bundles in sequence, at timed intervals. The illusion must move like a convoy." Someone laughed softly. "We're asking radar to believe in fairy tales." Joan replied, "That's the only kind of story war ever tells." The room went quiet. For weeks, she and her small team worked without sleep. They built new packets of chaff, shorter, lighter, engineered for perfect descent. She calibrated their fall rate, their drift angle, the density needed per nautical mile. It was meticulous, mathematical, almost holy in its precision. Every test was run in secret. Pilots flew at night, dropping the bundles over open sea. On radar, the results were breathtaking. Streaks of white light marching across the screens like fleets of phantom ships. One operator whispered, "It looks alive." That was the goal. To give radar a heartbeat it couldn't tell from real blood. June 4th, 1944, the weather broke. A storm lashed the channel, grounding aircraft and delaying the invasion. Joan spent the night in her quarters at the TRE outpost, listening to the wind claw the windows. Every gust sounded like history asking for permission. She wrote one last set of instructions in her notebook. Each drop every 15 seconds. Maintain radio silence. If intercepted, keep releasing. The lie must be complete. The storm cleared 48 hours later. The invasion was back on. June 5, 1944, 9 p.m. The first of the Ghost Squadrons lifted off from RAF Manston and Lympne. The pilots were hand-picked, calm, precise, willing to vanish without glory. Their payloads weren't bombs, but brown paper bundles packed tight with silver strips, the reflections of 1,000,000 non-existent ships. In the darkened hangar below, Joan watched the aircraft rise one by one, the engines dragging ribbons of light into the mist. She didn't wave. She only whispered the timing under her breath. 15 seconds. 15 seconds. Over the channel, the night was cold and windless. The sea below looked like liquid slate. At exactly 11:20 p.m., the order came through. Begin dropping. One by one, the crews opened their bomb bays. Out spilled the chaff, billions of metallic slivers, catching the moonlight, drifting like snow over black water. From the radar stations along the French coast, the illusion came alive. German operators at Boulogne and Le Touquet leaned over their scopes, eyes widening. Dozens of echoes appeared, growing, spreading, forming what looked like two massive fleets heading straight for Calais. Panicked calls flooded command posts. Searchlights swung north. Artillery crews loaded shells. Entire divisions shifted position toward nothing. Joan's ghosts had gone to war. Meanwhile, far to the south, the real invasion fleet crossed the channel toward Normandy, unseen, untouched, its approach hidden behind the false storm. In the air, Allied bombers dropped paratroopers into darkness. On the water, soldiers prayed into helmets. And somewhere, back in England, Joan sat by the radar screen at the control station, watching her illusion hold. She said nothing, just stared at the phosphorescent dots that weren't real and smiled at how power could live inside a lie. By dawn, German radar still showed the phantom fleets hovering north. Reports claimed an invasion of more than 400 ships. Even when the truth reached them that Normandy was burning, the delay was fatal. Reinforcements stayed trapped near Calais for 48 hours. That was enough. D-Day succeeded not only by courage, but by misdirection. The soldiers stormed the beaches under a sky haunted by a woman's invention. History would never record her in the orders of the day. But the radar logs, hidden in German archives, still tell the story how on June 6, 1944, 944, the air itself became an accomplice. After the invasion, Joan walked the cliffs above Dover. The sea stretched quiet and endless beneath her, the same channel that had divided and now connected continents. She thought about the millions of strips of foil drifting somewhere out there, sinking slowly to the seabed. Fragments of deception, resting among real wreckage. A young officer joined her. "You know," he said, "the generals are calling it the most successful trick of the war." She shook her head. No, the success was that it ended the killing sooner. Her voice was flat, not proud like someone who'd seen too much of both science and men. In the months that followed, she continued her research, new radar defenses, new countermeasures, new ideas for a war that was already dying. She'd proven something more profound than strategy, that intelligence could turn darkness into shield, that invention could be as decisive as courage. But even as victory banners rose, the names on the patents didn't include hers. The files were sealed, the credit dissolved into committees. By the time the world celebrated peace, Joan Curran had already faded into classified silence. Still, the world she'd altered kept moving. Planes flew safer, battles shortened, and the radar, once a tool of perfect sight, was forever marked by her fingerprints of confusion. That autumn, when she visited the laboratory one last time, she found a roll of leftover chaff on the floor, a dull silver coil, the color of rain. She lifted it gently, feeling how light it was, how fragile. All war was like that, she thought, terrible and weightless at once. She slipped a single strip into her pocket. Later, as the sun set over the English coast, she stood by the sea again, wind pulling at her hair. The war wasn't over yet, but its ending was visible now, faint and far off like radar detecting land through fog. She had helped build that horizon, and the ghosts she'd summoned to protect the living were dissolving into peace. Europe burned itself to grey, and the smoke of victory smelled no different from the smoke of ruin. In London, bells rang over the rubble. In Berlin, silence did the same. Joan Curran stood at the edge of it all, a scientist in a wrinkled coat, hair streaked with ash and sleeplessness, watching history crawl from the wreckage it had made. She had given the sky its invisibility. Now, she wondered what it might cost her soul. When the telegrams came back from Normandy, the numbers looked impossible. The deception had held for 2 days, just long enough. The beaches were taken. The losses were terrible, but the tide of war had turned. Her invention, Window, had not just blinded the enemy, it had given courage shape. Pilots called it the Silver Snow. Commanders called it a miracle. Joan called it enough. By August 1944, the Allies pushed across France. Hitler's empire cracked like glass under a boot. The air war thinned. The sky grew quieter. But for scientists like Joan and Sam Curran, the work did not end with silence. The world had learned too much about the power of invisible forces, radar, radio, atoms. The next war was already humming beneath the last. So when the British government asked her to join an international collaboration on nuclear physics, she said yes. She didn't ask where it led. She already knew. 1945, Los Alamos, New Mexico. The desert heat dragged across the earth like a whip. Here, beneath the mesa and the crows, the world's brightest minds built something darker than night. The Americans called it the Project. Joan arrived with Sam, one of the few married couples among the physicists. Their names were buried in security rosters, their work split by code and need to know. She was tasked with designing precision measuring devices for atomic implosions, tiny instruments that could read the heartbeat of an explosion. It was not the kind of science that left your conscience intact. The desert swallowed sound, but the laboratories screamed quietly with equations. Every morning, she walked to work through dust devils and heat haze, the mountains dragging long shadows behind her. At night, she stared out the small barrack window at the black horizon, whispering to herself. The power to vanish was mercy. The power to destroy is something else. The men around her, Feynman, Oppenheimer, Teller, argued about beauty and physics, about saving lives through terror. No one argued about the price. On the 16th of July 1945, the desert answered them. The first atomic blast, Trinity, tore the night apart. The mountains glowed. The sand turned to glass. Joan felt the tremor miles away, in her bones. She didn't cheer. She didn't speak. The world had finally learned how to erase itself completely. When she returned to Britain after the war, she was 30 years old and already centuries older inside. She left behind the heat and the secrecy, but not the burden. London was rebuilding, cranes rising where churches had fallen, people laughing too loudly, as if to drown memory. But in the Ministry of Supply, Joan went back to her work radar, signal interference, countermeasures. War had changed its uniform. The new enemy was ideology, invisible and cold. She was offered positions she couldn't publicly name. Her husband took a professorship. Together they built labs, mentored students, laid the groundwork for the next generation of scientific defense. Yet her own name stayed behind the curtain. When papers were published, her contributions were assisted by Mrs. Curran. When medals were given, they were pinned elsewhere. That was the custom, the quiet theft of women's triumphs, disguised as tradition. The same system that had denied her a degree now denied her authorship. History kept its eyes on the uniforms, not the lab coats. But time, as she'd learned, bends to persistence. By the 1,950 seconds, her students whispered her story like folklore, the woman who fooled radar, the invisible scientist. Her idea, once classified, became military doctrine worldwide. Every major air force used chaff. Every radar operator trained to see through it. And every time those bright false echoes appeared on a screen, somewhere her ghost smiled. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik. The world looked up again. Radar became vision, not defense. Satellites replaced spotters. The age of invisible warfare had evolved into an age of endless surveillance. And though no one asked her, Joan Curran understood what was happening. The machines were learning to see everything, except the people who built them. Her personal life, too, ran like a radar sweep oscillating between brilliance and isolation. She and Sam had children, a small house outside Glasgow, a garden that smelled of earth and rain. She loved gardening more than conferences. Plants, she said once, don't lie, and they don't need recognition. When visitors came, they found her with dirt on her hands, trimming roses with the same precision she once used for aluminum strips. Neighbors called her the professor's wife. None knew she'd once hidden an army behind smoke, but every now and then, the past found her. Letters from veterans arrived, pilots who'd flown through her chaff storms, airmen who'd lived because of her invisible armor. They thanked her for what she'd done, though most didn't know her full story. She read each letter carefully, folded it back, and filed it away in silence. She was proud, yes, but pride was dangerous. Pride had leveled cities. Humility, she decided, was the only weapon left that didn't kill. 1,960 seconds. The Cold War tightened. Radar technology grew sharper. Satellites mapped the Earth in perfect detail. Yet, military strategists still relied on chaff, cheap, fast, and effective. In Vietnam, in Korea, in the Persian Gulf, decades later those same glimmering strips drifted through the air, confusing missiles, saving lives. The ghost she'd released from her lab in 1942 refused to die. By then Joan was older, her hands slower, her eyesight fading. But the fire never left her voice. She lectured occasionally, her Welsh accent soft but precise. When students asked about her invention, she said, "It wasn't genius, it was desperation. War gives you that kind of clarity." She paused. If you're lucky, you survive long enough to wonder whether clarity was worth it. Recognition came late and quietly. In 1987, nearly half a century after Cambridge had refused her degree, she was finally awarded an honorary doctorate, Doctor of Laws, University of Strathclyde. The audience rose in applause. Joan, grey-haired and slightly stooped, smiled only once. She accepted the diploma, not for prestige, but for the memory of the young woman who'd rode the cam in the morning fog, chasing equations that would one day change a war. When reporters asked what she felt, she said simply, "It's about time the paper caught up with the work." By the 1,990 seconds, she rarely spoke of the past. Sam passed away. The world moved faster than memory. Computers replaced radar scopes. The Cold War thawed into commerce. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, she'd tune an old radio to static the same hiss she'd once turned into protection. The sound comforted her. It was the sound of her life's work. Organized chaos, useful confusion. She lived long enough to see female scientists rise in the ranks she'd been barred from, to see documentaries that hinted at her name. But her face never became famous. That was fitting. Her greatest gift had always been invisibility. Joan Curran died in 1999. No parade, no obituary headlines, just a line in a newspaper. Physicist Joan Curran, inventor of radar countermeasure chaff, dies aged 83. But history, at its best, is a radar itself. It eventually finds what was once unseen. Today, her invention still flutters in the air above battlefields and test ranges, still confuses radar, still saves pilots. It also drifts in museum displays, thin as memory, reflecting the same light that once blinded an empire. Her work has outlived ideology, generals, nations. Invisible, but undeniable. When historians speak of technology that won the war, they list radar, code breaking, atomic physics. They often forget the simplest miracle, a strip of foil that made death lose its aim. But somewhere between those silences, between the footnotes and the forgotten photographs, there stands a woman who turned reflection into salvation. She proved that light itself could lie, and that truth could survive inside that lie. Her story is not about war, not truly. It is about the human instinct to protect, to adapt, to find mercy, even inside machinery. The same instinct that drove her from the fog of Wales to the deserts of New Mexico, from invisibility to eternity. Imagine it, a black and white photograph, edges frayed with time. A woman in a lab coat stands before a radar screen glowing pale green. Behind her, the world is breaking apart and rebuilding at once. Her hands rest on the table, steady. She looks at the machine that once deceived an empire. The machine looks back. For a moment, both are silent, bound by what they know about light, illusion, and faith. Then she turns away, leaving the image unfinished like every true pioneer does. And when the next storm of static rises on radar, when another phantom army fills the sky, the echo that comes back is not just noise. It's her,